Welcome back to Max Hazel Lessons once more. Today it is Orchids by Hazel Simmonds McDonald. Thank you so much for stopping in. If you are new to my channel, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Turn your bell notifications on as well so that you won't miss a video as soon as it's uploaded. If you're returning to my channel, thank you so much for stopping in. As always, I do really appreciate you all being here. So let's talk about orchids. The literal meaning of the poem is that the persona is moving from a house that she has been living in for 5 weeks. She has already sent her belongings to her future home, but she has that orchid still remaining in her old space. The persona makes it clear that she was given the orchid as a gift, but she also implies that the whole idea of getting the orchid had no special meaning or value because the gifting of orchids is habitual for the people who gave it to her. People always tend to give you flowers for occasions, right? And so she sees no value in receiving that orchid. She describes the flower as being odorless, but yet it was attractive. Now, she watered the orchid once, expecting it to die. She didn't think that it would die. But here is the shocker. The orchid survived. It not only survived, but it had also bloomed for her. The persona contemplates plucking the bloom and pressing it between the pages of the books that she had to preserve it in some ways. The purpose of this idea is to allow her to appreciate the flower that bloomed despite the fact that she had not taken care of it. Now, the structure of the poem. The poet uses blank verses. This means that there is no rhyming pattern. And this is effective because it captures the persona's struggle between hope and despair as he or she tells the story of life with a tone that similarly and occasionally goes between the feeling of being optimistic and the feeling of being pessimistic. This adds to a mood that varies between being contemplative, being serene, and also that idea of a foreboding uncertainty. No. The use of emotive language is there. As the poet describes the aesthetic pleasing orchids, the poet notes, or the persona notes, that the purple petals or blooms, and goes on to say that it's fully blown, light polished poems. This morning, the bud unfurled. Now, this is juxtaposed against the persona's destructive intentions. When the persona says, I watered them once, I would toss them out, I starved them, I'll pluck the full blooms and press them. This is indicative of the persona's seeming lack of appreciation for the orchids as a natural and as a philosophical emblem of beauty, wisdom, and strength. Now, when we talk about the tone of the poem, we can almost say that there is some kind of boredom and some kind of musing. The persona is just there thinking. There is no emotion towards the orchid that has bloomed, but the persona is merely reflecting on what is going on. We talk about the themes in the poem. It would be death, nature, and also survival. Now, the symbols. The orchid is a flower, and it is magnificent in so many ways, and it brings across the universal message of love, beauty, wisdom, thoughtfulness, luxury, refinement, affection, strength, development, and new growth. The elegant flower would make one want to feel a bit pampered. Now, we must understand that in the symbolic element of the orchid, the reference to purple is important. The purple is the color of royalty. It is the color of bravery. Orchids are generally seen as symbolic because of their rare and delicate beauty. Their graceful appearance draws immediate attention from those who see them. And the fact is that the orchids have a reputation of being exotic. It's unusual because of the different species, yes, and it brings about a sense of refinement and innocence to those who want to see it. Now, literary devices in the poem, there is a simile. The orchid's full bloom blossoms are being compared to a polished poem in lines 13 to 14. The word polished in this instance offers a comparison, and it implies perfection, being pleasant to read and being shiny, just like an orchid, a poem would do the same. There is a pun in line 11 where it plays on the words. The purple heart literally signifies a splash of color in the center of the orchid's blooms. But you could also use this as a pun because it would refer to the bravery of the flower And this is so because a Purple Heart in the military is a medal that a soldier receives for bravery. It's one of the highest awards that a person receives in the military. There is metaphor in lines 1 to 2. The persona compares her experiences over the 5 weeks with the boxes that she uses to pack her belongings. Now, the mood or the atmosphere, the mood of the poem is thoughtful in many ways, pensive perhaps, and the persona is thinking about the lack of value that she places in the orchid. Let's look at the poetic structure of the poem. Now, the form of the poem may reflect the frequency with which the persona changes addresses and the length of the time spent in each location. We're going to go further into a line-by-line analysis after we talk about the structure here. So you will get a picture of what we're talking about when we say the short lines, which signify the short length of time that the persona spends in a given location. This, again, is illustrated by the number of stanzas. There are 10 of them, or verses, perhaps. The number of lines per stanza and the sporadic or uneven length of the lines. Now, when we look at those, we realize that the 2 lines in the first and second verses may correspond with the 2 weeks that the persona spends in 2 different locations. The third stanza, it's 4 weeks. The fourth stanza, it's 3 weeks. The fifth stanza is 5 weeks. The sixth stanza is 3 weeks. Seventh stanza, 1 week. Eighth stanza, 2 weeks, and the last 2 stanzas, it's a division of the poem where we find that there is 1 week each there. Again, you can look at the visual and structure of the poem as being symbolic of the persona somehow shifting or moving from place to place, almost nomadic. And this is a narrative poem. Of course, it is telling a story, and the story that it tells is how the persona moves from one place to another. The poet uses blank verses. And again, the blank verses have no rhyming pattern. This is effective because we see, as the readers, we see the struggle between the despair and the hope that the persona encounters in her life or his life. Now, this is basically, again, a narrative because it tells the story of the persona's life with a tone that similarly and occasionally goes between being optimistic and pessimistic. Now, when we think about it that way, we think about the poem being contemplative. Again, the poet makes references to so many things in the poems that will give us that general idea. Now let's look at the poem line by line, all right? So, I leave this house, boxed pieces of the 5-week life I've gathered. Again, look at the shortness of the lines. This connotes a broken, fragmented, disjointed, divided, separate existence that the poet experiences. Perhaps a relationship that the poet refers to here. The house is symbolic in many ways, as it represents a persona's drive, desire, quest, journey for security, safety, and belonging. The persona is actually the first person narrator here, and he leaves with his belongings packed away in boxes that he has gathered over the 5 weeks that he has lived there. We go on to lines 3 and 4. I'll send them on to fill spaces in my future life. The persona here is referring to his possessions and the fact that he has transported them, sent them elsewhere. As he continues to build, as we continue to see a buildup of the persona's possible failed relationships in the past, and the fact that the persona is now shifting the lifestyle. In lines 5 and on, one thing is left, a spray of orchids someone gave from a bouquet, one who makes a ritual of flower-giving scent. Now, the stem of the orchid is called a spray. But then when we look at multiple sprays, we're talking about a bunch. Now, the persona under-received a gift of orchids taken from a variety of other flowers. It was not just a bouquet that the persona was given. And this is perhaps symbolic of the persona's own perennial or continually shifting, that whole ability to move from places to places in the persona's existence. Perhaps in a mental state, yes, or physically. He is always moving from one house, one location, one place, one space emotionally. And I'm going to go with space too. Yes, from one space to the next without anything that is concrete. The persona is always on the move. persona changes address and is not confined, is not set in one particular place or space. Therefore, we realize that there is no permanence, there is no stability to the persona's movements. The orchids have no fragrance, but purple petals draw you to look at the purple heart. That's line 10 to 11. Now, we can always assume that the orchids have lost their fragrance in many ways. They no longer appeal to the sense of smell, but because of that single bloom, it continues to appeal to the sense of sight. And we see that the persona is inspired by their regal, their magnificent, that almost royal beauty that is presented in that purple bloom, and is forced to look within his or her own soul, his or her own heart, and his or her own consciousness to find that introspection, that whole ideas of analyzing self, of the persona's seemingly distraught, withered lifestyle, continuous movement. There is no enrichment. In many ways, there is no rich enrichment or inner beauty, and so the persona is actually drawn to the regal, the magnificence of the beauty of the orchid. Now, by looking at that purple heart that comes out in the orchid, the persona is also reflecting on the purple heart or the badge of the military merit. And this persona is reminded of the inner need to find strength and courage to go about doing whatever he or she does in his daily life, to encounter those challenges, to face the challenges then with the strength. Now the persona goes on, I watered them once when the blossoms were full of bloom, like polished poems. Here we see the comparison between the orchids and a poem. A poem that is polished is good to read. It's good on the eyesight, it's on the knowledge base, whatever. Now the purple petals here is compared to a polished poem. I was sure they'd wilt, says the persona, and I would toss them out within the 5-week litter. Now, when one thinks of an orchid, and if you're familiar with those flowers, and I did put some flowers at the start of the video, so you have an idea of what the orchid is. The beauty of the orchids can be compared to a well-written poem, and this is what the persona is doing, as I said before. The persona thinks about the fading beauty of the orchids, the message, the value, the meaningfulness of the whole idea that the flower that he or she thought would die had not died. The allegory comes out here, and this is a literary device. The allegory here may be true of poetry as well. A poem never dies. A poem will outlive the expectations of the poet. Even a poem that doesn't have sound, and there is limits to the craftsmanship, that poem has the potential to grow into something that is important. And this is reinforced by the persona's use of the simile in lines 13 and 14. The persona says, when the blossoms were full blown like polished poems. So right there, that's another literary device that you can think about, that the blossoms of the orchids were compared to polished poems. They were stubborn. I starved them. They would not die. Now, this is something that is important to recognize, that the persona was impressed with the fact that these orchids did not die. Despite the failed attempts to try to kill that flower, the flower did not die. And perhaps we recognize too that these are the failures of the persona, the dishonest, distrustful attempt to deny, to disregard, to abandon the whole inner feeling of admiration that the persona would not have wanted. And what happens then is that the persona has great admiration for these orchids and their symbolic referent. And this is overcome or resisted by the orchid's beauty, the resilience of the orchid, and the fact that the orchid could adapt to social, historical, environmental, and geographical changes. This means then that despite the attempts to get rid of that orchid by not watering that orchid, the persona learns the lesson that the orchid is resilient to the hardest times. And perhaps this is a lesson to the persona too, to understand that just like the orchid, one can become resilient, one can become strong towards whatever seriousness is happening in one's life. Now, the persona continues in line 20. This morning, the bud at the stalk's tip unfurled. The blossoming bud here is symbolic of new life. There is renewed hope. There is opportunity for the persona to achieve. And this is a lesson that the persona learns from the orchid. Just as if the orchids can adapt to whatever situations are there, whatever challenges that the orchid encounters, whatever bad weather is there, this is a lesson that the persona learns, that he too or she too can learn to develop endurance. The orchid's resilience then is meant to remind the readers, it is meant to remind the persona that the dark night of the soul's despair will eventually give way to the glorious morn of hope, prosperity, and liberty. In its truest form, there is a pastoral elegy in memoriam, and this is compared to the 19th century poet, Lord Tennyson. I think I'll pluck the full blooms, press them between pages of memory. This is a persona's desire to hide, to confine, to keep his own seemingly nightmarish truth or reality of what is perhaps happening in the persona's life. It's an attempt to end a potentially fruitful way of life, a new beginning, because perhaps the persona again is fearful of accepting or embracing the uncertain future that he or she will encounter. And the persona is probably afraid as well to live his life to the fullest potential. Now, when the persona runs away from his past, he avoids the present, and the persona hinders, in fact, the future. This shifting lifestyle appears to be something that the persona encounters all the time. It's a recurrent problem for the persona. Because again, we look at the structure of the poem, the shortness of the lines will also indicate that the persona does not spend enough time in any given place for whatever reasons. Now, the persona goes on again, perhaps in their thin, dry transparency. This means that as the pluck orchids die between pages of memory at the hands of the persona, so too will the persona's opportunity to find a new beginning. Now, this is the acceptance that the persona reaches, that there is a deadly influence of personal drawbacks and unresolved emotional hurts on the way that the persona intends to move forward. Persona goes on again to say, I'll discover their peculiar poetry. Long after the poets, just like the orchids, have died, their poems will continue to live on. They will give insight, they will give purpose, they will give that hidden beauty, the message, the vision that there is more to life than appears at the surface. The orchids, like the poem, take on a new life, new meaning of their own. And during this continual cycle of life and death, one learns that in life there is death, and in death there is life. As one generation of orchids die, another will take its place, another will bloom in its place, another will blossom in its place. Similarly, as one generation of poets die, another generation will come forward, and they will continue to have their poems live on in the memory of new writers. Now, by embracing the oxymoron or the paradox here, in the presence of death, one will find the true meaning of life. The persona here not only appears to desire death, but the persona also believes that death will solve his or her problems, the disappointments that he or she faces. Now, in death, the persona believes that there will be a better, a brighter life or a future. But the orchids serve as an effective metaphor for the poetry and the poetic craft, because the orchid teaches the persona a new lesson.